And we're just going to wait a moment because many more people are coming in.
How are you, Francesca?
I'm good, Marty. It's good to see you.
Good to see you.
I will want to hear more about the Auerbach conference.
Oh, yes, yes. I think it was fairly successful. Did you get a copy of the recording? I don't know if I sent it to you. I will send it
I
to you.
didn't. Thank
I
you.
will send it to you, yes.
So good morning, everyone. We're just going to wait one more minute before we get started in earnest with this morning program. It is time. Why don't we get started? Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to our friends that are outside of the US. My name is Francesca Bregoli. I am the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center that is sponsoring this morning's program, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to our third public event of the spring semester. It's so nice to see so many friends on this Zoom call and also some new faces. So if you would like to learn more about the Center for Jewish Studies at the Graduate Center, please email us. I'll make sure to put our email in the chat box momentarily, and we'll put you on our mailing list so you can get updates about our upcoming spring programs, and you can also follow us on Facebook. This morning's program will feature a conversation between Professors Devi Mays and Adriana Brodsky about Devi's most recent book, Forging Ties, Forging Passports, Migration and the Modern Sephardi Diaspora, that is also a winner of the 2020 National Jewish Book Award in Sephardic Culture. I want to alert you to a 20% discount that Stanford University Press is offering currently on the book. You'll find the code again in the chat box momentarily. Let me just give you some information about the format, although all of us are by now probably really used to these Zoom meetings. We are going to start with an introduction by Professor Mays, which is going to be followed by a conversation between her and Adriana Brodsky. And towards the end of the program, there will also be an opportunity for questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please type question in the chat box and I'll make sure to unmute you in the order that I receive so you can ask your question. This event, as you can see, is being recorded. Later, it will be uploaded to the center's YouTube channel. I want to invite you to keep your microphones muted throughout the duration, and please feel free to turn off your cameras if you have any concerns about privacy. Let me now briefly introduce our two speakers. Devi Mays holds a PhD from Indiana University and is assistant professor of Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. She is a specialist on transnational Jewish networks in the Mediterranean and global contexts, with a particular focus on Sephardic Jews. Her first book is Forging Ties, Forging Passports, the book that she's going to discuss today, which once again won the 2020 National Jewish Book Award in Sephardic Culture. Adriana Brodsky is professor of history at St. Mary's College of Maryland. She is a historian of Jewish immigration to Argentina in particular, and to Latin America in general. Professor Brodsky is the author of Sephardi, Jewish, Argentine, Creating Community and National Identity, 1880-1960, which appeared with Indiana University Press in 2016. She is also co-editor of The New Jewish Argentina, Brill 2012, and of two special issues of the Journal of Jewish Identities, one on Jewish youth in the global 1960s and one on Latin America. So without further ado, Devi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Francesca, for the introduction and for inviting me to speak about my book here. And thank you so much, Adriana, for agreeing to be the converser so that we can have a conversation after this. We mentioned, or we talked about beforehand, that we wanted it to sort of feel like we're having a conversation in the living room, and indeed my living room is right behind me. So in some ways, this will be a conversation, at least from my living room. And for everybody who joined, I really appreciate that you made time to come to this discussion, since at least for me, this was the last week of teaching at the University of Michigan, and I know that it's a stressful time for those of you who are teaching, and a stressful time for all of us, and we all sort of have Zoom fatigue. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint as I give this talk, so that you can see some of the materials that I'm working with here. So give me a second. Right. Okay. So I'll start out with the mention of a man by the name of Mauricio Fresco, who sort of plays an integral role in my book. This is a picture of Fresco in the mid-1930s. But we'll go ahead in time first. So in the spring of 1949, Mauricio Fresco, who was living in Mexico City at the time, wrote a letter in French to the renowned Turkish Jewish historian Abram Galante in Istanbul. "I doubt you will remember me," said Fresco, since they had last met 29 years before, when Mauricio was but a youth. Mauricio reminded Galante that the latter had regularly visited the offices of Mauricio's father. His father's name was David Fresco, and he was the editor of El Tiempo, which was the longest running Ladino language periodical in Istanbul that circulated widely in the Ottoman capital and beyond. And Mauricio sought to get information about his father from Abram Galante because he said, "Unfortunately, I was too young and naive to be able to inquire about my father and my father's past, or to know much about it, since his father had died in 1933. And he went on, "Although much time has passed, I still have fond memories of those who collaborated with and loved my father, since I must confess that I am proud to be his son." And Mauricio went on to sketch a brief portrait of his life for Galante, since Mauricio had left the Ottoman Empire as a young man at some point in the midst of World War I. He said he had worked in America as a journalist. He had published many books and articles in a variety of languages, and had also spent time in Russia and China. And Mauricio explained that he had involved himself in what he called the world of diplomacy. Protected by this diplomatic post, he had witnessed both the occupation and liberation of Paris. He had seen the occupation of Manchuria by Japan, and had fled Shanghai for New York under the threat of death for having published, under a pseudonym, a book called Shanghai Paradise of Adventurers. And this book sought to expose the corruption of European and American consular officials, Catholic priests, and the League of Nations representatives alike. Mauricio did not tell Galante that it was in fact the Mexican diplomatic corps in which he had worked for 18 years, but he did explain that his experiences had compelled him to prepare a new book, which he would call Forge Your Own Passport. And this is partially where the title of my book comes from. This book, which he unfortunately never published, Mauricio noted, would, quote, "prove the stupidity of passports, visas, nationalities, races, etc." Fresco's letter, and particularly his disdain for passports, visas, nationalities, and races as means that enabled, in his view, the exploitation of humanity, hints at the central tension that my book aims to explore. And this is that states make themselves states in part through distinguishing between citizens and subjects or possible interlopers. And they do this by controlling the entrance and exit of both populations. And this is enabled by documentation such as passports and visas, which are often refracted through the categorization of certain races or nationalities or religions as more desirable than others. What I aim to explore in my book, though, is how individuals like Mauricio Fresco and several other thousand Sephardi Jews that I look at confounded state attempts to classify them and thereby regulate and restrict their movement. Over the course of his own life, Fresco and thousands of his Sephardi co-religionists migrated from areas in the Ottoman Empire and its successor states to Western Europe, the Americas, and beyond. For these individuals, and I'll show you, this is from my own research from data that I've collected on the populations that I look at, but these are the places that the migrants came to be or claimed that they were from, and you'll see that they're mostly clustered around the Aegean, which is the center of the Ladino language, the Ladino cultural sphere, as Aaron Rodrigue and Esther Benbassa have called it. These are the different nationalities that the people who originated in this area claimed to have acquired over the course of their travels and their lives. And when we're talking about travels, these are the places that I was able to trace these migrants traveling through. So you can see that it ranges from Hawaii to the southern cone of South America, throughout the Americas, throughout Europe, South Africa, East Asia, and South Asia. For these individuals, migration was often the most effective form of removing themselves from violence or oppression, of employing their education, of exploring opportunities for economic advancement and social mobility. And if states attempt to categorize and make stable and fix populations, the groups of people and the individuals that I examined really thrived in motion, in blurring these categories that were not as rigid as consular and border officials liked to believe, or at least liked to portray to their higher-ups and to the press. And sometimes these diplomatic officials even had a vested interest in enabling this ambiguity. So with Mauricio Fresco, for example, his career was in part facilitated by the acquiring in 1926 of a falsified Mexican birth certificate that said he was born in Mérida in the Yucatan. And he also attributed his defense of the downtrodden to his being Mexican. His family, likewise, that was spread between France, Mexico, and Los Angeles, knew that the David and Rebecca Fresco that Mauricio listed as natives of Mexico City on this falsified birth certificate, and here is images of his parents, were in fact from Constantinople. And it's precisely these characteristics that defied confinement within these external categories that at times enabled individuals like Fresco and other Sephardi Jews to cross boundaries and borders effectively. So these migratory laws and restrictions were not all powerful, and the individuals I explore in my book drew on a number of tools at their disposal in order to respond to or to subvert these legal regimes that perhaps sought to exclude them. And this prompted state responses. So we see this sort of ongoing dialectic between states and individuals on the desirability of certain types of immigrants or certain types of immigration. In this book, the approach that I take is really looking at individuals and the networks they created, and this is what drives the book's narrative and the analysis. So in contrast to many studies of migration that look at specific organizations or take a top-down, state-centered approach to examining migrants and the institutions that aided or combated or relocated them, here I'm looking at the networks that Sephardi Jews employed, the ways that they appeared on different documentation as they traveled through different states, through different countries, and how in part this created a modern Sephardi diaspora, and at the same time how it shows the incredible adaptability of these migrants to adjust to different languages, to different legal regimes, in order to continue to move. So I look at through tracing the movement of individuals across time and space, and through various archives and periodicals in 6 countries and at least 14 archives, I look at the way that these migrants played with their religion, sort of how they described their religion, nationality, ethnic, racial, and gender and class taxonomies, and controlled how they were understood across different legal and national regimes. The individuals that I look at in my book lived in a state of what I call hypermobility, which is sustained, long-term, nonlinear migrations that lacked a clear teleology. These people, which you can see in the life of Mauricio Fresco as a fantastic example of this, moved very frequently, whether in the form of what were intended to be permanent relocations or as prolonged business trips between destinations throughout the Mediterranean, Caribbean, Atlantic, and beyond. Nation states and national laws mattered for them, but we shouldn't necessarily automatically accept the nationalizing states as the norm and these transnational individuals as the exception. Even the people who were ostensibly settled in one country moved frequently within its borders. And oftentimes we see a sort of process of internal migration that occurred before international migration. We see that people might have, for example, or within these Sephardic populations, might have, say, traveled to the United States first, remained there for up to 10 years at times, acquired American, or sort of sought out American first papers to declare their interest to nationalize, and even acquire American citizenship before deciding that for them there was more path for economic mobility and integration and success within Spanish-speaking countries throughout the Americas. And this type of hypermobility that I look at required acquiring and maintaining certain tools, whether linguistic, monetary, legal, extra-legal, that enabled this continued mobility. And this mobility was often aided by others of the same linguistic and religious background. And these Sephardi individuals shared strategies with each other, shared information with each other about different migratory regimes and changes in legal categories for immigrants, whether those trying to enter the United States or France or Cuba or Mexico. They formed patronage networks, loaned each other capital and goods, they shared homes, and sometimes they even shared documentation with each other. So I want to sort of wrap my introduction up quickly so that we can spend time on these, on the discussion. But I do want to emphasize that for the people who I'm looking at in this book, they came to, that they lived in this period of immense change and flux, that many of them, most of them were born into the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire ceased to exist during their own lifetime. And they were faced with the establishment of new nation states in the places in which they had lived. And so sometimes, as Devin Nar has really astutely pointed out, he's another scholar of modern Sephardi history, that it wasn't always a choice for these individuals between choosing between an old country and a new country, or the old world or the new world, because their old world was profoundly different, even if they remained where they were. And so in migrating, these individuals created, through their hypermobility, through their networks of communication, of trade, of exchanges of knowledge, of marriage patterns, they created a diaspora. And in doing so, it demonstrates, I think, that not all people participate in what we think of as linear migration, or from point A to point B, or in finite migration, that is, remaining in point B after they get there. But rather, these individuals, these Sephardi Jews, relied on an intensive process of nonlinear movement among multiple regions and between multiple states. So returning briefly to Mauricio Fresco, he did not mention to Avram Galante that he himself had acquired false papers, although the title of his never published book, Forge Your Own Passport, could easily have been drawn from his own actions, those of many other Sephardi compatriots, and the many practices that he had witnessed during his diplomatic service. Fresco, born a Sephardi Jew in Istanbul, in Constantinople, when it was the capital of the Ottoman Empire, would have been sort of increasingly excluded from all sides of the nationalizing states that emerged in the wake of World War I. And he had seen firsthand the horrors that restrictions on mobility and ideas of scientific racism posed. In the book Shanghai Paradise of Adventurers that he published in 1937 and which forced him to flee Shanghai under the threat of death, he sought to expose the ease with which passports could be acquired through false means or imported, which is getting an authentic passport purchased from its original owner. He went on to explain that there were, quote, millions of people without the documents necessary to prove the nationality to which they belong. And he noted that World War I had, quote, modified the map of most of the world. Countries and cities changed hands. Men and women entered or left before or after the reappointment. Many, probably like him, evaded military service or deserted, so that, and this is him quoting from him, so that today thousands upon thousands are refused the right to a passport or even recognition of their nationality. And he said that these prohibitions and these immigration restrictions were often linked to economic and racial meaning. Ottoman-born Jews like himself continuously contended with the lack of documentation to prove their nationality and obstacles on their movements for economic and racial reasons. And I go into this quite a lot more in the book. And finally, to sort of wrap up, I want to emphasize this dialectical relation between migrants and the state, that migrants help to create the state, even as states create migrants. And the figure of the migrant looms very large in today's popular and political discourse, as I think we are all very familiar with. But the figure of the migrant has occupied a primary position in the public imagination for far longer. And I use the term imagination deliberately here, since migrants are sometimes cast as beneficial contributors of labor, capital, or genetic material, but they're also cast as potentially nefarious, diseased, criminal influences that could undermine general welfare. And they exist as a figure of imagination, as a foil to project broader social, political, and economic concerns of the states from which they're immigrating, through which they are traveling, and into which they are trying to enter. And in such discourse, the humanity of migrants is overlooked and the stories and all of their complexities are disregarded. And so in my book, I really try to, I hope I succeeded to do, showing the humanity of these individuals and centering their stories and their experiences. And as Mauricio Fresco, fresh out of his Mexican diplomatic career, wrote to his father's old colleague in Istanbul in 1949 regarding his book, Forge Your Own Passports, he said, quote, "Certainly everyone engages in exploitation due to these passport visas, nationality, and racial regimes, but this does not mean that everyone, or that one should abstain from denouncing it." So I'll stop there and turn the conversation, or open up the conversation with Adriana.
Well, thank you.
No.
Can people hear me?
Looks ready for Shabbat for me. What's Carrie doing?
Okay, so thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I think your last words actually just gave, provide the perfect segue into some of the questions, because yes, the book is a book that's centered on these individuals and the way in which Devi has been able to reconstruct their lives and to give us a sense of all these movements and performances, right, that as migrants face, right, these restrictions that are imposed on them, not just by the states, but in many cases, right, by even the same communities that they belong to. And so I was one of the first, besides, Mauricio Fresco, whose story opens and ends the book. I was also drawn to Devi's description of Asael's photographs. These initial, these initial examples, right, of migrants performing, right, the self, the family, and their communities as a way to strategically, right, position themselves to access, right, what they want, which is the possibility of upward economic mobility. And I'm gonna let Devi present these the discussions of these photos, and I hope that in doing so, she perhaps can provide some other examples of migrants performing their selves, their families, and their communities as strategic moves as they face, right, some of these systems, coercive systems that are trying to to keep them, right, from moving as much as they want.
All right, so excellent. I'm going to share my screen again to talk about another figure in the book who I talk about quite frequently, is a Izmir-born Sephardi Jew named Mauricio Asel. There are a lot of Mauricios in my book, and this sort of coincides with a shift in Sephardi naming practices, so that the name Mauricio or Maurice, if they're in France, is sort of the more modernized or westernized equivalent of the name Moïse or Moshe. So Mauricio appears as Mauricio, but there's also this hovering specter of his Jewish name behind him. So he was actually one among the first Sephardi migrants to make their way to Mexico, and he arrived in around 1905, together with 4 of his brothers, who all came around the same time period. And one of the really interesting things that you can see through the images of Mauricio Fresco, and I'm really disappointed that these images are not actually in the book, so I described them, but I could not get permission to publish them. So I'll show them to you here. But this picture, if you see the picture on the far left, is a picture of Mauricio that he took in Izmir before he emigrated from the Ottoman Empire. And he's dressed in this sort of very stereotypically Turkish style that, likely given his family's class background, he would not have wore on a regular basis, sort of given his family's class background and educational status, and that some of the members of the family were Italian proteges, so they had sort of Italian protection. But if you look at him here, he's, photographed in a photography studio, which was something that sort of upwardly mobile Ottoman Jews and others in the Ottoman Empire engaged with, was going to these studios and having their photographs taken. But he's dressed in sort of these pants that are loose at the thighs, elaborately adorned ottoman upon a Turkish carpet, it looks like by the patterns, wearing a fez upon his head. It looks like he also has a sash around him. So this is a picture that he took in the Ottoman Empire. Right. The picture in the middle is taken from 1905, when he and his wife first set foot on Mexican soil. And so you see in this picture, in the center, a very different image of Mauricio Fresco that he's engaging with. And I don't know if you can tell from this picture, but they're in the port of Veracruz, which was the port of entry for most most Sephardi Jews into Mexico in this period. And they're posed in front of a thatched hut. They've gotten sort of indigenous Mexicans to pose next to them, holding sort of what might be considered stereotypical items that indigenous people would wear, who are wearing the manta cloth that was part of indigenous costume. The woman has a child in a rebozo, in a shawl around her back. And in contrast to the setting in which they're placed, Mauricio and his wife, whose name was Rachel Corey, who was also from the city of Izmir, are both dressed in a very Western style, a very European style. And particularly, if you look at Rachel with this sort of high Edwardian travel outfit with a collared shirt buttoned all the way up to her throat, multiple layers of clothing. This could not have been comfortable in the very humid environment of Veracruz. And yet here in this photograph, they're casting themselves, you can't tell by looking at them that they're Jewish, but they're certainly casting themselves in opposition to and in conversation with the indigenous people that they're posing next to. And this image Mauricio sent to his brother Isaac, who later became known by the name Francisco, or shortened to Ico, and this propelled Francisco or Isaac to then immigrate following his brother. And it's, in fact, this image was preserved. Actually, both of these images of fresco are preserved among the descendants of Ico Asael. And then in the picture that you see on the far left, or far right. This is a picture of Mauricio Asael from 1918 when he was asked by the Mexican government to serve as the honorary consular representative of the Mexican government in Izmir. So here you have yet again a photograph of the self-fashioning that looks remarkably different from the two earlier images. So his hair is carefully marcelled and in sort of a careful coif. He's wearing a cravat, a tie, he's dressed in a suit, his mustache is trimmed. So this is a picture of somebody who's attained wealth. He was one of the most prominent members of the Jewish Ottoman community in Mexico. And this was then a photograph that was published in the Mexican press multiple times over the course of the early 1920s. So you see how he's playing with his clothing, his self-fashioning, and his wife is doing this as well to sort of show that they're desirable immigrants in Mexico. Another way that you see this sort of playing with the foreign or their ambiguous background is through this sort of adoption of like the vision of them as being related to France or having these French connections. At this time, France was the second largest Sephardi diasporic population after the United States in the world. And they're playing with this idea of France as being the center of haute couture, the center of fashion, the center of culture. And they named, for example, and this was something sort of across the board amongst Sephardi migrants particularly, they invoked this connection to France. So here, this is a business by two Sephardi immigrants, Corquidi and Palachi. This Palachi, Miguel Palachi, was actually the son and grandson of Izmir's chief rabbis, but their company is called Paris Bijoux, so they have a French name here. Here you have one of the Asael's companies. So this is Mauricio Asael was in business with two of his brothers at this point. And if you look at this image between them, Asael and another Sephardi Jew, Isaac ben Deniste, they note at the bottom that they had houses in Paris, Germany, and Austria. So they're playing up these transnational and French connections. And this is another advertisement from another one of the Asael brothers, who was first Yohanan, then Jean in France, and then Juan in Mexico. And you can't really see it in the reproduction that I include here, but they give the actual address of what they say is their store or their supplier in Paris in the Sentier district, which was a center of sort of middle-class Sephardi life and the ready-to-wear fashion industry in Paris at this time. So we also can see, through self-styling, they're playing on their ambiguous foreignness and trying to sort of portray themselves in a way that is most advantageous to them, but also through the advertisements and marketing for their business. and I don't know, like I don't know if we want to talk about it here, but this is also one of my favorite images and documents that I engaged with in my book and that I found. This is an identification card issued to a woman named Rebecca Mitrani, who was in Cuba with her family. She had been there for over a decade at this point, and she was attempting to migrate with her family to Mexico from Cuba. And these ID cards are really fascinating. There are thousands of them from many foreigners, including Sephardi Jews, but also Ashkenazi Jews, Syrian Jews, and all sorts of other people. And they contain different biographical information about the person who is portrayed here. I'm going to highlight a few things on here that are really interesting to me in terms of how she is playing with ideas of what she expects Mexico to want in a migrant. So she says here that she was born in the city of Kirkilise, and she says that the city is in Greece. This is actually, and I should say, this is a period where Mexico had forbidden the entry of Turkish immigrants, but not Greek immigrants. And this is critical here. So the city of Kirkilise was never in Greece. It is a sort of in Thrace, but it was in the Ottoman Empire. It's in Turkey. Today, the Turkish name for this is Kırklareli. There was a different Greek name for this city. And so her use of this particular term is actually the Jewish name for the city that is not in Greece. So here's a clue to her Jewishness. But if you look at this, right, her religion, she says she's Orthodox, that she's Greek Orthodox. And actually, once she was in Mexico, she goes back to being Jewish. But there are other hints to her Jewishness on this, this document. So if you know Sephardi naming, sort of Sephardi surnames, the surname Mitrani is also a very Thracian last name. So if you're attuned to that, you would know likely that she was a Sephardi Jew. But oftentimes in migrating to Mexico and elsewhere, Ashkenazi Jewish surnames were the names that were sort of identified as being Jewish. And so Jews from Arabic-speaking populations and the Ladino-speaking world did not have identifiably Jewish last names. I should also say this is a period where Mexico is sort of shifting towards viewing Jewish immigrants in general as being undesirable and inassimilable into the Mexican nation state. So they're claiming to be Orthodox is also a deliberate strategy to get around these restrictions that were growing against Jews. But another hint to her Jewishness is how she signs her name. She signs her name in Soletreo, which is the Sephardi version of Hebrew, of the Hebrew characters. Now, to a Mexican immigration or consular official, they would just see perhaps that this was in a different alphabet, but not know that this was in the Hebrew alphabet. They might not know what Greek looks like, right? So it's all Greek to them. But you can see her Jewishness coming through in another way, through her use of the alphabet. So all of this, I think, really highlights how attuned these individuals were and these communities were to what was expected of them in order to show themselves as being desirable, whether racially, in terms of their nationality and in terms of their religion. But so like we can see here how she's playing with that. But another thing that I want to sort of highlight from my book is that I'm not making identity claims here. You can't look at this document and say, oh, I know all about how Rebecca Mitrani identified herself. This is clearly showing how she played with the perception of her to an external audience. Okay, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think you've touched on some perfect examples to illustrate this point that I was saying, that it is clear, right, through your text, right, how migrants are choosing, right, depending on the situation in which they find themselves with, and to the degree that it is possible, to strategically, right, perform different aspects of their identity. And I think that here, perhaps it is important to note that he also suggests, and I'm going back to Isael's photo and the company, his company and his brothers, as well as the others that you mentioned there, and their attempt to upplay, right, their French connections. That, Julia Cohen has also noted, right, that in the United States, Ottoman Jews tended to actually upplay that particular identity connected with issues of, exotic connections, but that in the case, right, of the migrants that you are discussing in your book, right, what they are downplaying, right, that Ottomanness, that exotic identity, and upplaying, right, their French, which, right, given the context of Latin America and the sort of the liberal project, right, that attempts to, turn these Latin American nations into examples of Europe, because Europe is imagined as, right, that culture that needs to be emulated. I think that, it clearly shows that these migrants are attuned, right, to how much they can sort of play, these French connections. And I guess that, this sort of, which you do in the book, right, sort of highlighting the different ways in which Ottomans are playing with, right, their European ties or their Ottoman identity, which you also mentioned changes through time. And that is an important element, to remain, to discuss. And, this connection of the liberal project in Latin America, until mostly 1930s. I wanted us to think about, right, the ways in which the Americas played, right, in this story, the sort of the differences, some of the differences that you identify with US Jews, but also, right, to what happens in Latin America. And so I'm going to just, perhaps ask you to elaborate a little bit in, how is it that Latin America figures, right, in this story of migrants? And so to them, right, how did they imagine, how did they see, how did they come to think of Latin America as a place of origin? And I think that you make a clear case, right, that the often heard assertion that Jews that we find in Latin America really wanted to go to the United States, but couldn't, and therefore made it to the United States. I think you make a good point that no, in many cases, this was a particular choice that they're making. So I'm asking you to perhaps, start, telling us, right, how is it that Latin America figured, to the migrants whose stories you piece together, and how does it figure to you, right, as you kind of see this, this movement, these people moving in and out and within in the story that you tell.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, I mean, one of the things that I was trying to do in this book was to, as you noted, sort of push back against this emphasis in much of the scholarship that Jews who ended up in Latin America did so because they couldn't enter the United States. That, Latin America, different countries within Latin America were not their first choice. And one of the things that I found in my research, as I mentioned before, is that I came across quite a substantial number of individuals who first were in the United States and then deliberately chose to move to Mexico and remain in Mexico. And one of the things that this really relates to, there are sort of two things that I'm connecting it with in response, is the languages that they spoke. So there was much more of a similarity between Ladino, Judeo-Spanish, and Castilian Spanish or Spanish. And I should step back and say that Sephardi Jews, the people who I'm looking at, are very multilingual. Many of them knew, in addition to Ladino, they knew some Greek, Turkish, Italian. Many of them were, from the Alliance schools, quite familiar with French. Depending on where they were in, the Ladino-speaking world, they might also know Bulgarian, various Slavic languages, some degree of Arabic, Hebrew. So they were very, very German, very multilingual, but English was not often one of the languages that they knew. Whereas Ladino was. And so many of the people who I was looking at in my book really highlighted the similarities between Ladino and Spanish as making Latin America seem more familiar to them, who viewed that they could integrate financially or like both socially and economically much more easily in Latin America through the similarities between Ladino and Spanish and how quickly they were able to acquire Spanish from Ladino, and that actually created multiple opportunities for them to have a different position and sort of a Jewish hierarchy than you might see in the United States. So within Mexico, a lot of almost all of the early intermediaries before 1917, the end of the Mexican Revolution, almost all of the intermediaries between, say, the municipal government of Mexico City or the national government over things like acquiring land for a Jewish cemetery, it was Sephardi Jews of a Ladino-speaking background who served as the intermediaries between the broader Jewish communities that were being formed and these Mexican officials. But there's one other thing that I want to highlight. I'm going to show you, again, another image from my screen. For those of you who are familiar with Ladino, you can read along with this. It's not the full article, but it's part of this. This was an article published in La Luz, which was a Ladino language periodical from New York City. This was published in 1922. So it's before the full quotas went into effect that were prohibiting or limiting immigration to the United States. And this article is called ¿Por qué los Sephardim deben pensar en México? So why the Sephardim should think of Mexico. And it was an article encouraging Sephardi Jews to immigrate to Mexico for a number of reasons. One of those was the linguistic similarity between Ladino and Spanish that they said would facilitate the integration, so that they said a Sephardic, or Albert Avigdor, who wrote this, said within 3 months a Sephardi Jew can speak Spanish perfectly. But there were also a number of other traits that were emphasized here. And I'm using this as an example, but I came across a number of other articles like this, both within the American Ladino press and also within the Ladino press in the Ottoman Empire and in Turkey and in Greece. So this is not a sort of singular example. But here, what else Avigdor says that is really interesting in terms of thinking about how Sephardi Jews envision themselves fitting within Mexico, but I've also seen articles like this in terms of Argentina, in terms of Cuba, is that they say, well, you know what? We have a lot of cultural traits in common, right? Because they, like us, we are a product of 1492, but 1492 was also the year that sort of Spanish colonialism began in the Americas. So the people in the Spanish-speaking, the sort of Hispanophone Americas were created simultaneously with us. And we both bear a legacy of a Spanish past that has left profound and often hard or challenging imprints on us as a culture. And other similarities between sort of the Hispanophone culture and the Sephardi culture. So they say, well, we both like to socialize a lot. We both like to talk with people. We're both used to frustrating politics and corruption, but we all bear it without too much complaint. We are used to struggling economically, but also to the possibilities that we can have here. And so the mention of the similarities in terms of language, but also in terms of cultural background, was a means of, or like one of the underpinnings of why Sephardi Jews, some of them at least, looked at Latin America as an alternative to the Anglophone world where they didn't necessarily fit in the same ways. And I should also note that key to this is that especially after the Mexican Revolution, and I can speak more to Mexico than elsewhere, Adriana, your work obviously on on Argentina engages with a lot of these similar questions. But that Mexican national identity, particularly after the Mexican Revolution, was really connected to this idea of mestizaje, of this cultural and genetic mixing between different populations. And one of the key aspects of this mestizaje was the combination of the Spanish and the indigenous to create this new mestizo nation. And precisely because Sephardi Jews had this Iberian connection, the Mexican state also viewed them in some ways as being Spanish and as fitting within this project of mestizaje. Unlike Arabic-speaking Jews, unlike Jews from Eastern Europe or Central Europe. And so they privileged and really encouraged this Sephardi migration, you know, prior to the 1930s, while this sort of liberal project, as you said, was really in effect, precisely because they saw cultural commonalities between Sephardi Jews and this project of mestizaje that they were building, and therefore they saw Sephardi Jews as not being incompatible with this broader process.
Yes. So yes, thank you. I think that you make also, right, the claim that, you know, Mexico is going to go through these, you know, through these different ideas about what the perfect or what an acceptable migrant, you know, should look like. And we will see that, you know, as we move through time, some of the things that they want at some point, right, are going to disappear and are going to actually be the quite the opposite in other points in time. And so, you know, there will be a point and you discuss that in the book when, you know, Spanish, right, are not going to be accepted, and they are going to be, you know, in a sense, challenged because of that. And perhaps we can come back, but I think to that issue. But I think that one of the things that I wanted to, you know, to touch on or to ask you to expand upon, because I think your book just does a fantastic job of explaining and presenting to us, is this Ladino language cultural sphere that you discuss so well. And so based on, right, on this language and the cultural products that are coming out of that, you know, the ways in which you know, these migrants that you talk about are connected to, right, not just you know, to the language, to the families, to their business partners that are, you know, situated all in this sphere. And so you talk about, right, Galante, and whose father was the editor of El Tiempo. And so, and you talk about, right, how important these newspapers were in distributing information that then, right, migrants themselves could use, right, to present themselves in a better light, you know, by choosing from all the alternatives that this, you know, period of flux, right, had afforded these immigrants. And so, and what is interesting, I think, that because of the connection that you make to Spanish, is, you know, for example, in Argentina, there is no, you know, Ladino, right, newspaper, because, right, it just goes straight into, you know, into Spanish. And so I was wondering if you could just, you know, for the rest of the audience, to paint, you know, a little bit of that picture of that Ladino language cultural sphere.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you see also in Mexico, there was no Sephardi sort of Ladino press in Mexico either. So there was a Yiddish press, sort of multiple Yiddish newspapers in Mexico in the same period, but that wasn't something you see with Ladino in Mexico. But that's not to say that the Sephardi Jews, Ladino-speaking Jews in Mexico were not part of this larger network of knowledge and exchange through print culture in Ladino. And so, you know, from when I started this research, like, you know, in the like 1900 or so, through the 1920s and into the 1930s, and it gets a little bit dicey after that because a lot of the Ladino press was shut down, particularly after the death of David Fresco in Istanbul, and Elia Carmona, who had a very long-running newspaper as well. the Ladino press wasn't as strong in the 1930s, in Turkey at least, as it was in the earlier periods. But we see, like, you can look at circulation data, or information about who was circulating these newspapers, that newspapers from the Ottoman Empire had people, sort of agents selling them not only in Ottoman lands, but in Western Europe, in Skopje and other places in the Balkans, throughout the Americas. So, like, unsurprisingly, say New York or New Jersey, but also Seattle, also Indianapolis, also Montgomery, Alabama, also Los Angeles, which within the United States had prominent Sephardi communities, but also elsewhere in in the Hispanophone world. So Mexico City, Veracruz, Havana, Buenos Aires, Montevideo, and other places in the Southern Cone. So these newspapers from Ottoman lands or post-Ottoman lands were being distributed in the Americas. But the American Ladino press was also being distributed throughout the Americas and back to Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. So we see the exchange of knowledge going in all directions. There were people throughout the world, Sephardi Jews throughout the world, who would contribute articles to the Ladino press from wherever they were to report on, for example, the development of the Sephardi community in Argentina and the different institutions and organizations that Sephardi Jews were building there. The same thing in Mexico, sometimes even, like, there was one case where someone in Veracruz wrote a letter into, forget which New York-based newspaper, saying that a Sephardi Jew killed a man. Killed another Sephardi Jew in Veracruz. And the newspaper in New York published that story and said, well, we're not going to publish the name, but we know that he fled to the United States and that his brother lives in New York and he better turn himself in. And then the next week they published a retraction and said, oh, it was actually not a Sephardi Jew who brutally murdered this person, and we apologize. So you see these sort of transnational policing networks. Men who had abandoned their wives, their names were also called out in the Ladino press, throughout the Americas, of saying so-and-so in Rio left his wife, keep your eye out for him, essentially, so that she's not an aguna. And so even if we see the press the Ladino press as having several hubs, the spokes extended throughout the Ladino-speaking world and was really a critical way of exchanging information, exchanging knowledge about these new communities in the Americas and elsewhere, but also about, migration policies and various other things.
Yes, I think that that sort of highlights this argument and the claim that you make, right? That they're building this diaspora, and one of the ways, right, is through utilizing, right, this shared culture and language. Perhaps before we go into the questions and allow our audience to participate, I was just you mentioned the aguna, and sort of this brings up the issue of piecing together the lives and the movements of these female migrants. You do touch upon, Mitrani is a character that is a migrant that appears in your book. Sara Halfon de la Hanna is another character that generates a lot of press and movement of information surrounding her death. But I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how elusive, right, they were in trying to piece the story together. That probably was something that was easier to do, right, with male migrants. And if you could just perhaps tell us a little bit about what was specific, right, about their experiences as female migrants.
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I'm sure as you know, Adriana, and I'm sure as many of you other people here know, it's often more difficult to trace women through archival records. Before sort of addressing the question of how we can see the unique experiences or some of the figures who I look at in my book, I'll just point to some of the problems that we might see. So, for example, like the migration card that I showed you of Rebecca Mitrani, it says on there that she's a homemaker. Her profession is a homemaker. And on a lot of these cards, you'll see that women were listed as homemakers. Women during this time period would automatically acquire the nationality of whatever nationality their husband had when they got married. And so we see, for example, very few women who petition or apply for Mexican naturalization because their husbands are doing that. And if their husband, there's no need for them to do it if their husbands do it. So we don't see women as visible, as clearly in the type of naturalization papers that I look at. But we do see that women are also engaged in this pattern of hypermobility. So oftentimes women might travel with their husbands on these extended business trips or vacations, whether to the United States, to Cuba, to elsewhere in the Americas, to France, or back to the Ottoman Empire. So women were engaged in this travel. And there are other ways of gleaning women's roles in and sort of activity within, say, the commercial sphere for the Sephardi world. So oftentimes, if men, went on these extended business trips, sometimes up to 6 months, to go to both New York and Paris to acquire textiles or like clothing to import to Latin America, that it was their wives who were running the businesses in their absence. And you can see that, say, through court cases where somebody might be bringing suit against someone else, and it is the woman who is representing the business interests there. And we know from oral history, or you can also see from some court cases, that women were very active in, Sephardi women were suing other people for not paying for an item that they purchased. And so particularly through these court cases, you can see that while some documentation might say that women were homemakers, that they owned their own stores or they operated their own stores, that they took legal action against those who were not paying on time. So we can see sort of that activity in those ways. And then, of course, also in oral histories and in oral sort of memoirs, we see a lot more people talking about women's active roles. And another thing to keep in mind is that for Sephardi men, some of whom were peddlers, oftentimes they peddled goods that their wives and children would make at home. So even if we don't see the women sort of in what the man is doing economically, women played a vital role in that. So, turning to the question of the aguna, we were all familiar with how that could be a particular challenge for Jewish women, Sephardi and otherwise, in this era of mass migration. That, we have plenty of stories from the Ashkenazi world and Sephardi and Arabic-speaking worlds of men who left their wives, maybe intentionally, maybe unintentionally. And so, for example, you see a lot of Sephardi women writing letters to the chief rabbi of the Ottoman Empire or to the Ladino press saying, "Can you find my husband? I want to know where he is, perhaps to divorce him," right? So you see women engaging in this type of activity. But I've also come across a few instances of women abandoning their husbands. So, I can't link it to, say, issues of spousal abuse necessarily, but I've also come across a few cases of men reaching out to the Ottoman chief rabbi and saying, "My wife took my child and left me in Cuba, and I think she's in France, and I don't know where she is, but she can't leave me like this. And please try to make sure that she can't remarry someone else." Or in one particular case, a woman who had first naturalized in the United States with her husband fled to Mexico with her children after a series of experiences of spousal abuse that she had gone to American authorities to try to prevent. She ended up going to Mexico, where she had a sister who was very well connected, one of these women who owned her own businesses and initiated a lot of lawsuits. And in part through her sister's networks, she was able to get a divorce, even though her husband followed her to Mexico. And there she was capitalizing on the easier divorce laws in Mexico, where a woman could initiate a divorce, whereas in the United States that was not not possible. And she ended up acquiring full custody of her children and setting herself up as a dressmaker, and supporting her family, her children herself, and even engaging in this type of hypermobile international trade. So she would travel on business trips to acquire goods. So we see women being active in those ways. So I'll stop there, I guess.
Yes, maybe it might be good, Francesca, to open it up.
Yeah, I think this is a good time to open it up to the larger audience. And while we're waiting for people to type questions in the chat box, or if you would like, if you are able to unmute yourself and have a question, you can just type question, meaning the word question, and we'll unmute you. But let's, there are a number of comments already in the chat box, though none of them are a question. But I do, let me just get started. I was really interested in your use of the term hypermobility, and I'm thinking of other recent studies in modern Sephardic history. You know, I'm thinking, for instance, also of Sarah Stein's family papers. And I guess I would like to ask you how you see your intervention in this field that is developing of mobility studies and network studies, specifically applied to the modern Sephardic world.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I think in terms of migration studies in general, or histories of migration in general, it has largely moved away from looking at migration as sort of an A to B process, and there's much more interest in the process of transmigration. So looking at migration, you know, as people were moving through different places, what their experiences might be in trying to acquire papers to get somewhere else. And you know, within Sephardi studies, this is a field that is growing, and particularly Sarah Stein is somebody who's done a fair amount of work on this. So her book on extraterritorial dreams engages with similar questions. I think in one way that my book contrasts with that is that particular book is much more sort of a top-down. It takes a much more top-down approach to where Sephardi Jews fit in. So for example, looking at them within the context of the British Empire, or within the context of sort of Spanish and Portuguese, potentially extending protection or citizenship to Salonican Jews after the Balkan Wars. And it's really looking at case studies more from a top-down perspective. And so one of the things that I was really trying to do in this book is to take to a lesser extent the view of a specific country and how these individuals fit within that regime, or fit within the categories that that country imposed, and much more on the level of individuals. Yeah. And I think you see that in Sarah's book, Family Papers, you see that much more, that sort of very personal connection to both the family and these diasporic networks, but also to these documentary regimes, and just how transformative the end of the Ottoman Empire was for Sephardi Jews living within that era. You know, that book is incredible in terms of having such a rich family archive to draw on. And I think most historians would, you know, our minds would be blown if we could ever find something like that. And so, you know, unfortunately, I couldn't do that in my book, but I tried to at least recreate what I could through the documents that I had access to. And so, you know, another thing sort of in contrast with Family Papers is that that family was a very elite family in certain ways. It was very tapped into, you know, the Salonican intellectual elite in terms of, you know, having these newspapers that they issued, also in terms of relations, you know, as Jewish representatives with the Ottoman state, and then, you know, for the Greek state. But this is not something that we see only elite Jews doing. That's something that I tried to show in this book, that it was really across class categories. So somebody like Mauricio Fresco, or say Miguel Palacci, or some of the early migrants to Mexico were from a fairly high status, and came to Mexico with a fair amount of capital already, and that aided their their settling and their establishment of certain networks, but then they provided patronage for newer arrivals of different class categories. And these patterns of hypermobility and connection were not something only of the elite of these communities, but it's really something, a practice that I saw across these categories, from the newest peddlers arriving in Veracruz, all the way up to somebody like Isaac Capon, who was another one of these early Sephardi migrants to Mexico and one of the early leaders of the Jewish community, who ended up sort of moving from having his own store into being an industrialist and having factories that would then employ newcomers.
We have a first question by Jessica Carr, if you would like to unmute yourself.
Sure, thanks so much. Thanks, Davy and Adriana and Francesca. I wanted to ask a question about diaspora and even maybe in conversation with terms like extraterritorial and those kinds of things. I know in the book you talk a bit about the concept of diaspora. And I was wondering if you can say a little bit more about, as a result of your project, like what you really think diaspora means, because I'm trying to think about it, whether it's kind of networks outside of one or more homelands, or whether it's like just the rejection of the idea of homeland. And then I guess connected with that, however you kind of understand what diaspora is, the way you're talking about how they're building a diaspora, do you think that's something that really explicitly emerges with hypermobility, or is there something about Sephardi diaspora that then is continuous with hypermobility?
Yeah, I mean, one of the, okay, what order to answer that question?
Sorry.
Okay, so the way that I conceive of diaspora in my book, I'm sort of building off of the work that Matthias Lehmann has done on sort of the emissaries to the Holy Land, and looking at diaspora. And this also is building on off of James Clifford's work. I mean, that's quite old, but really, it's critical to the way that I think about diaspora as not being something that automatically exists, but being something that it's a process that has to be maintained and maintained and maintained, whether that is through the physical movement of people in connection with each other in different places, whether that is through the exchange of goods or the exchange of knowledge. So we can see sort of that the way that I envision diaspora being formed is through these different networks of people and through the active engagement with other people in different parts of this world. So to me, it's really processual, and it's something that is in what I'm looking at, something that's ongoing. And it doesn't automatically exist. So, and how I'm thinking about diaspora here, it's not the Sephardi diaspora has always existed and does exist. I'm thinking much more about what are the mechanisms through which this group of people create a transnational community. And in many ways, I frame in my thinking, and I think this doesn't appear explicitly in the book, but you might be able to glean it from it, is a sort of deterritorialized idea of diaspora. So there's not an attachment to a particular place. And I know that this is different if you look at different segments of the Sephardi world in this time period, even where some Salonican Jews, for example, in New York or in Paris, are very attached to the idea of being Salonican, and that's something you can see in family papers as well. This is not something that I saw amongst the Sephardi Jews in Mexico, who associated and married and went into business across places of origin. And if you look at Sephardi migrants to Mexico and the birth data, or where they are born, they're not coming only from one city or one region. They're really coming from the entire Ladino-speaking world. So from Izmir, from Istanbul, from Salonika, of course, but also from Sarajevo, also from Sofia, Rusçuk, Plovdiv, Kirkilise, Dedeach, all of these, Aydin, like cities throughout the Aegean world. And they're forming associations that are not connected to the idea of being from a specific place. So this project, I think, allowed me to think of diaspora in a more territorialized way. And I forgot your second question.
Well, I actually think that you answered it with your response. That I was wondering, how you saw what the people you're studying, whether they're kind of the diaspora that they're building, how continuous it is with what was possible like prior to hypermobility, or if it was something that you were really trying to say, this is created by hypermobility.
So what I will say about hypermobility, like I don't want to say, like I always hate it when historians or anthropologists or other people say, this is the first time that something ever existed. Like we can never, I know that it existed here. I'm not a historian of earlier periods, but what I do know from looking at, say, the period that Francesca works on and looking at Francesca's own work, we can see that a lot of the types of behaviors that I'm talking about in my work are present in the Sephardi Mediterranean far earlier, right? Even perhaps predating the expulsion from Spain, but through looking at Geniza documents and other types of materials. So that this is not something that's new to the 20th century or new to the Sephardi world in the 20th century, but I think we can even see these patterns of hypermobility as well as the formation of diaspora in the ways that I talk about in this book as being something that is, from the early modern, even like we can see the same things happening in the early modern period or even the late medieval period. And, I would say that there might be something like there are aspects of this that are particular to the period that I'm looking at, which is the age of the passports, the age of mass migration, the age of the collapse of empires and the rise of new nation states. That puts a particular cast on the ways through which these people have to move. And sort of the ways in which the world is open or closed to them. But some of the other mechanisms, exist far earlier.
Great, thank you so much.
We have another question from Melissa Clapper, and she typed it out in the chat, so I will just read it. Can you please talk about what role gender played as Sephardi migrants interacted with the state and instruments of the state, such as passports or visas, as they crossed borders?
Yeah, so the question of how gender played out in the process of migration is actually quite interesting to sort of look at both the movements of women in terms of how they interacted with the state, but also in terms of how ideas of what gender meant and what gender was shaped how the state viewed them, and also again how they interacted with migration as a process. So oftentimes, and this is not something exclusive to the Sephardi diaspora, but I often saw that it would be men first who migrated, and then would potentially send for their family after they got a certain amount of money, after they felt like they were established enough in the places that they had decided to live. Sometimes they were married to people already, but one of the mechanisms that, and brought those people over, sometimes this is something I see often, but they would send letters to their mothers, say, find me a suitable wife from our community that And this is something we see also appearing in Ladino novels of this period, that the quote unquote Oriental Jewish man, but also Greek Orthodox Christians and also Armenian Christians from the Ottoman Empire, that the quote unquote Orientals always wanted to marry a woman from their home country. And so if they wanted a wife, they would either physically go back to where they were from or, have their mothers send someone for them. Because of how gender ideas played out in the Jewish community, it was often seen as sort of potentially shameful, or not necessarily shameful, but suspect for an unmarried woman to travel to marry a man. So you start to see, or I saw women who would marry in Ladino por pudor, so sort of have someone stand in for the husband in front of the rabbi in wherever they were immigrating from, and then have a civil marriage once they arrived in Mexico, so that when they were traveling as a married woman. I know this isn't about the state, but it's also sort of unique dynamics of how gender played out in migration. But I also came across a number of examples of women who had been exchanging letters with a man in New York or in Mexico, who they had been set up with, receiving photographs of this person, and then coming to the United States or coming to Mexico, realizing that he didn't actually look like his photograph. So maybe he was standing on boxes, maybe he appeared taller, maybe he had somebody else stand in as the picture, but then they felt obligated to go ahead with the marriage because it would be seen as disreputable. Yeah, sort of, I talk about this as like early 20th century catfishing. But that it would sort of be a ding on their reputation if they weren't to marry this man. This is another way that gender plays out. But then you start to see state involvement as well. So by the 1930s, for example, in Mexico had really clamped down on immigration from quite a number of places that no longer fit within, the sort of the model of mestizaje shrunk down. And Jews, it was difficult for Jews of all origins to immigrate, but one of the loopholes was through family reunification, so that for women, they had greater ability to migrate if they could show that they were married to a man, and this would sometimes require where instead of the sort of Jewish assumptions about propriety that would require marriage prior to migration, that the Mexican government would require that marriage existed or that family ties could be determined and verified. So that, for example, in order for a woman to get off the ship in Veracruz, her husband would have to go onto the ship and marry her civilly on the ship for her to be considered a family member. So like fiance marriage, there's no such thing as a fiance visa at that time. It had to be sort of a spousal visa. But other ways that sort of particular challenges that women and Jewish women experienced in what I was looking at is that Constantinople was one of the major hubs of Jewish sex trafficking in the sort of 20th century through the interwar years. And Buenos Aires being sort of the most famous example of another major destination of this, but that Jewish women faced, a lot of suspicion from state authorities if they were immigrating on their own or if they were immigrating only with other women. And so there were a number of telegrams that I came across in the Mexican Foreign Ministry archives where the Mexican consulate in Marseille would telegram authorities in Mexico and say, we heard that X number of Jewish women were traveling alone from Constantinople through Marseille, and you better meet them on the ship to ensure that they are not engaged in vice, right? That they are not they will not be sex workers, because that type of behavior was certainly not something that was seen as sort of acceptable to whether or not to the Jewish community, but certainly not sort of something that the Mexican government wanted in terms of immigrants.
We have time for one more question. So if you have a lingering question, this is your shot. You can either unmute yourself or just type it in the chat. In the meantime, there have been various comments about male brides in the chat, which I'll let you all read. If there aren't any more questions, then we can end the call. I just want to thank you all. Thank you, Devi. Thank you, Adriana, for such a stimulating conversation. And thank you for all your questions. I want to remind you of our next event in the semester, which is going to come up on Friday, May 7th, at 10 a.m. And staying in the sphere of networks, we will talk with Adam Teller about his recent book, Rescue the Surviving Souls, which talks about the Khmelnytsky massacres and refugees in the second half of the 17th century. And there will be a conversation between Professor Teller and Nick Terpstra. So I invite you all to come back for that. Thank you again. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you both, Adriana and Francesca, and everyone who had participated.
Thank you.
This was great, Devi. Let me just stop the recording.
All right.